case of disasters such as Northern California has seen with its fires, please discuss whether the allocation of tax dollars as remedy for losses is biblical. If not, what would be the biblical alternative? Well, almost all cases, you can have private fire services, and then the individual groups would have contracts between them or arrangements between them for mutual aid. Mutual aid is a huge factor where we would join forces with others against a catastrophe. In other words, it's the principle of the golden rule. What you'd want to have done unto you, do unto others. I would like them to help me if I have a crisis, so I will help them if they're in a crisis. It's my conviction that, especially with the technology we have today, you're in a much better shape to handle all these matters either privately or to make them a very carefully controlled adjunct without all these unions and things on this order, potentially the civil magistrate. I think it's a dangerous place to go, and it would have to be heavily proscribed, narrow limits, but it's much better to have that, if it even were to be a civil function, if it were to be in the terms of privatization. And there's no reason why it couldn't. I remember Mark Rushtoony speaking, we were in a car driving to Vallecito, in fact, with a reporter, and he was started to explain some of the interesting idiosyncrasies of the way the state and the municipality, the county, handled their fire services, and some of the oddball things that made it inefficient. That would not necessarily be the case, if I recall. And I asked if he would be interested in writing something on this topic for Chalcedon. He didn't feel competent to do it. He thought perhaps someone else could write to it. So he was a witness to it, but he didn't want to go ahead and expose himself to potential charge of not knowing the whole story. But what I did gain from the discussion is that there are problems aplenty that most people aren't aware of in the administration of these so-called emergency services. And of course, the use of tax money for it is a mistake, insofar as it's not a biblical model. So, I believe under a biblical model, with all the whole counsel of God being applied, remember that's such a key point, every jot and tittle, including the golden rule, you would have a very different situation, and it would run more favorably. And it would run more efficiently. You wouldn't have government issues. We saw this just with the Hurricane Harvey zooming through Houston a few weeks ago. The Christian services, which are all volunteer, were way out ahead of FEMA in getting there. When FEMA arrived, all it did was try to eject the Christians who had already been doing the heavy lifting there. And I think it'll be the same thing across the board. Lots of municipalities operate with volunteer fire departments until they get the quote-unquote blessing of a civil protection. That's not always translating into a benefit for them. Certainly not in the cost-benefit analysis that you could make on it. Not to mention the whole question of whether it's a biblical use of our capital for the state to extract by force taxation and say we're going to protect everybody, when in fact it's our obligation to have our neighbors back. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's the second greatest commandment, and you can put that into play privately. You don't need to have the sword of the state being the vehicle to deliver these services and see that they're taken care of.